All right, so I'm on the Black Death or Plague slide in the later Middle Ages section. Black Death is a bacteria, Yersinus pestis, which fortunately means nowadays we can usually use antibiotics to cure someone who is sick from it, and most of the time, if someone does catch it, we can deal with it, especially if quick enough. But antibiotics weren't developed until 20th century, less than 100 years ago. So prior to that, the Black Death was pretty nasty. The germs are usually carried on certain rodents. And then what often happens is fleas leaping between the rodents and people can transmit the disease. Although once you've got the disease, if you get the pneumonic version of it, you can do human to human. The most common form is bubonic plague. It's what it's usually called, is bubonic plague, which affects the lymphatic system, and people break out in these big black buboes, hence bubonic plague, in the lymph nodes in various parts of the body, and probably something around a 90% death rate for that. Pneumonic plague is about equally deadly, but instead of infecting the lymphatic system, it infects the lungs. And that's when people cough up lungs, they drown in their own blood. It's pretty nasty. Similar death rate. That's the one that can be transmitted, right, through coughing, sneezing, things like that. And then a very rare but very deadly form of the plague is the septicemic, where the blood actually gets infected. It's about a 99% death rate. That's one where you wake up in the morning with a temperature and not feeling well, and by the end of the day you're dead. So it's a pretty nasty plague. They had no means of stopping it for many centuries, and so it was pretty deadly. We'll take a closer look at it. So it'll reach Europe from Asia in 1347 through Mediterranean trade routes. And then the first pandemic, which covers everywhere, is 1347 to 1350. So I'm on the next slide, by the way. And you can see how it swept through from the Mediterranean, swept around. By 1350, it had pretty much hit all of Europe. Devastating, killed a lot of people. And then there will be further outbreaks. Here's what's key. That first one was devastating as it swept through. But then 10 years later, there was a second epidemic. Actually, probably the second one, we could probably still call it a pandemic. It was pretty much Europe-wide. But then about every 20 years, and then slowly expanding intervals over the next century or two, various epidemics or localized breakouts of the plague would happen in various parts of Europe fairly regularly through the next couple of centuries. That first pandemic possibly wiped out as much as 30% of the population. Certainly by the time we get to the end of the 14th century, after several other outbreaks that have happened, 2 or 3 other outbreaks, possibly we could have as many as a 50% population drop-off. So we're talking somewhere in the range of 30 to 50% population drop-off over the course of those decades, with most of them in that first outbreak. So it is devastating. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with this terrible plague? I'll stay on this slide. I mean, they have attempts by doctors to figure it out. And they understood loosely quarantine. In fact, quarantine comes from a medieval Italian word, quarantina, where for 40 days you would quarantine people on ships, for example. Then later on they would quarantine people in homes. And quarantine occasionally worked, but if you got rodents coming in and out of houses, or people sneaking in and out, right? Try and quarantine a whole city, and it's really hard to stop movement, as we all well know. So quarantine, they understood it. They understood that it seemed to stop the spread, but making it work efficiently has always been a challenge. They understand the purpose of the use of cleanliness, seems to help, and things like that. They would attempt various types of masks, which might stop you from breathing in the pneumonic version, but doesn't stop other versions. So there were reasonable attempts to do it, but because of the multiple sources of infection, because of the inability to really heavily enforce some of these measures, it really only very, very partially effective. So let's go to the next slide and look at how people responded outside of the, unsuccessful medical attempts, some of which were reasonable but just couldn't really do it. So the first thing you do is what causes it? What caused the plague? And the key element here was, okay, you go to the philosophers, you go to the medical people, the people who know. You talk to the secular rulers, you talk to the church. One of the main scientific explanations was that there was an unusual alignment of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, these planets with their astrological influences, which are often to do with death and strife and change, all three of them in a conjunction in the sky. They felt that the vapors from the combined conjunction of the planets affected the air on Earth, which was poisoned by the vapors from the conjunction of the planets and created the plague. This sort of poisoned or bad air is called miasma. So a lot of the times when you have a disease, a pandemic or an epidemic of a disease, since they didn't know bacteria, you're not going to figure out, they don't really know bacteria until the 19th century when we have good enough microscopes to find them. But even in the 19th century, like, how can that tiny thing kill a person? So, long way away. So they figured bad air, miasma, that's why you try to stop the bad air, is what kills people. And they thought the planets created the miasma. Another option, people thought earthquakes, volcanoes maybe poisoned the air and created the miasma, which is fine, interesting theory, but how do you stop it, right? They asked the philosophers, they asked the scientists, how do you stop this miasma from killing everybody? How do we get rid of it? And since they found that not everything worked, the scientists, the philosophers had no answers. They're like, well, we know that, but we don't know how to get rid of it. Open your windows and vent out your house or something. But if the miasma's everywhere, how do you vent it out? So they really weren't very helpful. The church thought, many people in the church thought it's because we were sinning too much and had allowed too much sin to happen. People looked at the 7 deadly sins, greed and gluttony and sloth and pride and envy and anger, and saw them around us and said, it's sin. We're sinning and we're allowing sin. We need to stop sin. The problem with that is, even those people who stop sinning, or even the young infants who have never sinned, die. Whereas evil people, murderers and rapists and thieves, sometimes survive the plague. So it's like, if God's punishing us for sin, why is he killing the innocent child and preserving the evil monster, right? So, we can try and stop sinning, but it doesn't seem to stop the plague. So explanations were there, moral and scientific, but none of them really came up with an effective way of saying, if we do this, the plague goes away. Because so that contributed to the feeling of helplessness. Even reasonable solutions like attempts at quarantine or cleanliness, like trying to, be less sinful, okay, didn't make any difference. And that's the problem. And when you got a lot of people dying and no one able to stop it, that's what messes with people's heads. And that's when the fear comes in, or the hysteria, the panic, okay? And that's when you start blaming others. You find scapegoats, okay? Then there's got to be someone who's making this work, that if we stop them, then we can stop it, right? Because people want control. And planetary conjunctions, miasma, sin, it's really hard to control that on a larger basis to stop a plague killing everybody. So people want, right? People panic, people fear. This doesn't work for humans to say, we're helpless, we're all going to die, right? It doesn't work. They want to, and so one way to do this, and what we do nowadays, and we still do that, is conspiracy theories. That there's a certain group of people who are maybe faking it, or maybe creating it, and who are going to profit from it, who are going to, do vaccinations, or cashless society, or the mark of the beast, or, right, as we've seen nowadays, conspiracy theories come up to explain a plot, which if you can thwart the plot, you can stop the problem. It makes it back into a manageable, controllable situation with an explanation, rather than the fact, no, there's a disease and people are dying. Okay. One of the biggest victims that we have always seen from the Middle Ages onwards are Jews. We've already seen how the French and English kings had kicked them out because they were considered, these untrustworthy bankers, right? And the problem with Jews, besides the fact that they're accused of this sort of financial dishonesty, even though they're the only ones basically allowed to do it, is, of course, that Jews were accused of being the ones who crucified Jesus, and being the ones who reject Jesus, and so therefore are in a way worse than heretics. And so they're a threat to Christianity. So you have the religious difference on top of the social condemnation, and Jews are always hated. And so one story that goes around is that Jews had gone around and were poisoning wells. And that's what was killing people from the plague. And so people freak out, and in Germany and parts of France where there may be some Jews still left, and in parts of Eastern Europe, and they have pogroms. A pogrom is essentially ethnic cleansing, almost like a genocide. We're going to kill all the Jews in our town to save ourselves from them from killing us from the plague, because they really seriously believe Jews were trying to kill Christians. They ignores the fact that Jews died from the plague just as much as Christians, and that you don't get the plague from poisoned wells. But it gives you a handy scapegoat, the already existing evil threat. So Jews are blamed, and Jews are persecuted. The townsmen would round them up. The local authorities would do a quick trial, sometimes involving torture, and then they would be burned at the stake or otherwise executed. And in a number of towns and cities, the entire Jewish population would be killed. In other ones, some killed, others driven out, which is moving the Jewish population further east into areas that were at that time less organized. And so, expulsions from England and France, persecution in Germany and Central Europe. Now, Jews are moving east. Many thousands of Jews were killed. That's the problem with the conspiracy theory, with the scapegoat. It gives you someone to attack. Another scapegoat was the sinner. Okay, like I said, the idea of sin being the cause of the plague and bringing down God's wrath. So the flagellants, to flagellate is to whip someone. Flagellants were groups of people going around who not only would whip themselves, right? You whip yourself to whip the sin out of you, sort of a self-punishment, right, for sinning, but also going into these towns and preaching and finding sinners and whipping them bloody. So again, this idea of we will persecute ourselves and others for their sin, and it, almost like a lynch mob going around whipping the heck out of people. Of course, neither pogroms nor flagellants solve the problem, and they actually fade off after a while when you realise you've killed all the Jews in the area, but the plague's still there, you know, or you've whipped enough people bloody, but the plague's still there. And both of these are officially condemned by both the church as an institution and by various kings, as saying, do not go around whipping people, do not go around killing Jews, this is irrational. So a bit of authority trying to enforce rationality, and a general idea of that this isn't saving us anyway. But because of the mass death and the real inability to stop it in any effective way, we have an attitude of uncertainty, fear, and helplessness. It's a crazy period. Very, very, very devastating. So what are the outcomes? Okay, as we move into the late 14th century and into the 15th century. And I've always wanted to, so I'm moving to the next slide, the second plague slide, the third, whatever, fourth plague slide. Okay, and I've got the term labour shortage here, which is your classic academic historian's way of saying, oh, half the population's dead, so we have a labour shortage. And it's a very dry way of describing a devastating, deaths of millions of people. But it is a labour shortage, and when you have a labour shortage, which is rare, right? Most of the time you have a growing population and more people than jobs, or more people than reasonable amounts of land can support. And so keep that fear and helplessness in mind. But when you get a labour shortage, wages go up, right? You don't have a bunch of people competing for few jobs. You have a few people competing for more jobs. Wages go up. Rents go down, right? Land is empty. Fewer people. I can pick and choose lower rents. So higher wages, lower rents. Guess what? Ordinary people, including peasants, are better off. Meaning consumption goes up. My rent's down, my wages up, consumption goes up. I can buy more stuff. We already had a growing economy. There's a crash when the plague kills half the people and you have to sort of figure everything out. But now it's growing and consumption's up and people have more money to spend. Boom. The economy in the 15th century is going to boom. It's sad, isn't it, to have a plague and population loss to make an economic boom. It's a very strange outcome of the plague. Technology becomes even more in demand. A labour shortage means, right, it's even more of, slave society is all labour. Then we had the medieval society where you had labour, but you also had to use technology. Now we have even fewer labour. We're leaning even more towards technological solutions, going back to the printing press, which was a technological solution in the 15th century to a labour shortage to increase demand for reading materials by people who had more money to spend on books. And various other technologies that are labour-saving technologies that will sort of evolve over time. We use water and windmills, which used to be for grain, increasingly for even more other things. So leaning more towards technology. And we begin to get the beginnings of capitalism, which is where you have these wealthy people who either in the country who own the land. And what they're doing now that you don't have a bunch of peasants who are renting the land from you just to feed themselves and have their own little surpluses, and you're making a living on rents are down. So I've got peasants renting from me, but I can't make as much living on rents. So what I'm doing as a capitalist is I'm using more and more land. I'm enclosing, fencing off my land rather than renting it to peasants. And then I'm growing crops for profit, or I'm bringing in herds of sheep or cows or whatever, and I'm selling that product. I'll pay wages to peasants There are peasants who are renting land here, little bits of land, but they also work for wages for me to me sell my produce at product, and I can make more profit selling, say, wool from a herd of sheep than I can from low rents from peasants. So it shifts them from a renting society to a capitalist society. What I mean by capitalist is the capitalist, which is either a landowner who's technically still a knight, or in the city a merchant who, right, again, instead of buying finished cloths of various dyers and weavers, there's too few, he pays them wages to make cloth for him. So what we have here is the person who owns the land or owns the wool and the machines and pays wages to workers who will make things for him. And in the 15th century, that's good for everybody because you have the efficiency of capitalism where one person is centralizing production. They own the land and I'm mass producing wool, or I own the cloth and I'm mass producing cloths. And the workers are okay with it because wages are high and I don't have to invest in land for myself or invest in all this wool and weaving equipment for myself. I just work on it and make a good wage. So when there's a labor shortage, capitalism's good for labor as well as the capitalist who owns the land or the things. And so that's the beginnings of capitalism. Of course, later on, when you have population increase and you no longer have a labor shortage by the 17th century, now wages go down, rents go up, and all of a sudden labor is not good. And we have a whole new phase of history. But we have, for a while there, great wealth throughout all society and even more technology. It's sort of an interesting thing. Let's go to the next slide. And this comes right out of the plagues. It's sort of one of our outcome things, like we talked about with schisms and war. This is an outcome thing. The Italian Renaissance is the, if you like, the third and biggest of the medieval Renaissances, right? We've had the Carolingian Renaissance, which is in court and church. We've had the 12th century Renaissance with the universities and lay literature and Gothic art and all this stuff. The Italian Renaissance is bigger because it's moving even more away from the church and is very much led by lay people, by non-church people. It isn't church universities and new churches and stuff. It's lay people, which makes it bigger, right? Because there's more people involved. That's why it's so influential. Is lay people consuming art and literature. And because of the 14th and especially 15th century increase in personal wealth for a lot of people, including the capitalists, the merchants, the landowners, they want to consume more, right? More higher consumption. And in Italy especially, there is this boom of wanting to bring back Rome, the glory of Rome. They'll never have the Roman Empire, but they want to go back to their heritage, their Roman heritage. So sort of a new source here. It's Italian merchants, incredibly wealthy Italian merchants, wanting to bring back all the Roman art and styles and so forth. So new consumption by lay people of classical art and literature. And what's helping meet this increased demand is the fall of Byzantium, which even before 1453, the fall of Constantinople, there are refugees in the 14th, 15th century getting out of Byzantium as the Ottoman Turks are taking it over and like, we're out of here. And these refugees are bringing Byzantine art knowledge, construction knowledge, more Hellenistic works that still haven't yet made it west. And there's actually a renewal of Plato, which gives us idealism, coming along with them. So we had Aristotle in the 12th century. Plato's the big guy in the 15th century with his new thing. So there's this, all these people then are reading literature and looking at art and having sculptures in the classical style made. And we have the Italian Renaissance born from the consumption got from the labor shortage of the plague and the new wealth, but also lay consumption having a lot of fun. Remember the fear and helplessness from the uncertainty that I may die. well, if I'm going to die from plague in 10 years, I'm going to live the best life I can. And part of the Italian Renaissance is, hey, I'm going to live it up because I might die in 10 years. So I'm going to go to the very last slide. Sorry, this is a long video, trying to get everything done and squeeze it in. Is from this, I'm going to live it up. So the very last slide, humanism, idealism. From this, I want to live it up because I might die, but also a Christian idea of I might die. I need to live a proper Christian life and prepare to meet God and go to heaven, which stems from the Devotio Moderna somewhat, but also revived from plague. I need to have a good Christian life, okay? And it's funny, isn't it? I'm going to live it up, have consumption and party, but I'm also going to have a good Christian life. But human beings are complicated. Somehow we can reconcile contradictions. And from this idea of people wanting to make the best of their lives to prepare for death, Plato's idealism fits. Let's see how much better we can make our lives, our communities, and so forth in the wake of the uncertainty of this plague, and in this now area of where we have consumption and wealth that we can do more things with. So in the moral philosophy, the focus is on the ars humanitatis, the humanities, the study of man. We're actually going to see in the 15th, 16th centuries a decline in natural philosophy, science, less interested in understanding God's creation in the world, more interested in man, human beings, human societies, civic humanism. How do I have the best running city or city-state? So the ars humanitatis, the study of man. How does man perfect himself? How does man perfect his society? So that's the number one thing, trending away from natural philosophy from the 12th century Renaissance, which was Aristotle's. How do we figure out how stuff works? Okay. Great classic books of the period, Pico on the dignity of man, literal humanism, right? Man, right, was made in God's image. God gave man reason. Man can strive to turn towards God and strive to fly with the angels. Okay, man is a dignified creature. If you look at the sculptures, there's a 12th century Renaissance one at the bottom, which is people in clothes, realism. Notice with idealism, which if you go back way back earlier in the semester to the ancient Greeks, right, we have the nude, the mathematically proportional, not anatomically correct, mathematically proportional, idealized body, from realism to idealism. Castiglione is the courtier, same thing. How does a person at court, a person in administration, a person ruling, how are you a good ruler in an idealistic, humanistic society? So this boom of humanism, refocus on man and his there. So it's interesting how, we go back and forth in the way we look at humanism, realistic, idealistic. Are we looking at moral philosophy or natural philosophy, different foci as we go? The Italian Renaissance, hugely influential, especially the humanist aspect of it as well as the art. And again, this sort of part of the booming cultural, artistic, philosophical, material sort of bounce back from the plague, which is really fascinating. And I'm medieval because, right, we basically started with Germans trying to become Romans when they defended the Roman Empire, and 1,000 years later it's the same thing. It's the descendants of those German tribes still trying to be Romans, and it all fits. And we have these renaissances, but they're not just copying the Romans or the Greeks, right? They're then saying, well, how do we make this fit for modern society? How do we have a modern city that works? How do we have a modern way of doing things? So these renaissances are sort of looking back, but the medievals are too dynamic, too changing to just want to go backwards. They use these look backs to then build on and move forwards. And it takes us into the 16th century, which we can end here, with a society that has overcome so many crises, including the plague. and is bouncing back with these cultural, philosophical, technological, economic, social, political developments that has got a society that is on the cusp of expanding globally and pushing forward in terms of wealth ahead of other places, at least temporarily. So this is why I'm a medievalist, because start with some German tribes, end with Europe, with us, right? Modern West, right there, 1500. We've set it there. We're off and running, despite and because of all the crises. And that is that.